My wife used to say I looked like a man who had never been surprised a day in his life. She meant it as a compliment, back when she still said things like that. Back when I still believed she meant most of what she said. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 of those years building things. Houses, mostly. Foundations, framing. The kind of work that teaches you to read a structure before it collapses. You learn to see the stress fractures before the wall comes down. You learn to notice what other people walk past without thinking. I noticed. I just didn't say anything. Not yet. This is the story of how I found out that two people I loved without question had been working against me for nearly 2 years. And how my son, my quiet, careful son, already knew. And how together, we decided not to make a single sound until the moment was exactly right. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I am not a vengeful man. I don't enjoy conflict. I like my coffee black, my mornings quiet, and my evenings on the back porch with a book I've probably already read. My neighbors would describe me as steady. My former crew would say I was fair. My brother would have said, once upon a time, that I was the most dependable person he had ever known. I think about that word a lot now. Dependable. It turns out it can mean two very different things, depending on who's using it. My brother is 58. His name is not important to this story. What matters is that he is 5 years younger than me, and he has spent most of those years standing in a shadow he believed was mine. I never saw it that way. I never thought of myself as someone who cast a shadow over anything. But I understand now that what I saw and what he felt were two entirely different realities. And he chose, somewhere along the way, to stop trying to reconcile them. Our father passed away 14 months ago. He was 81 years old, sharp until the very end, and he left behind a piece of property in central Tennessee that had been in our family for 3 generations, 47 acres, a farmhouse that needed work, a barn that needed more, and a timber contract with a logging company that was worth, depending on the year, somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000 in annual revenue. My father's will was simple. The property was to be split equally between my brother and me, 50-50. He had written it that way because he believed in fairness above almost everything else. And because he knew, or thought he knew, that his 2 sons were capable of handling an equal partnership. What he could not have known, what none of us should have had to know, was that my brother and my wife had already decided, long before my father drew his last breath, that 50% was not going to be enough. I found out on a Thursday morning in October. I had driven down to the property to meet with a land surveyor, a routine visit. Something we needed to do before updating the insurance. I arrived 40 minutes early, because I always arrive early. It's a habit from the job sites. You learn things when you show up, before anyone expects you. My brother's truck was already there. I didn't think much of it. He had a key, of course. He had every right to be there. But the second vehicle in the gravel drive was not a truck I recognized from the county or the logging company. It was a dark blue sedan. And there was a decal on the rear window from a real estate brokerage in Nashville that I had never heard of. I sat in my own truck for a moment. Just sat there. My coffee was still warm in the cup holder. The morning was gray and very quiet. The way Tennessee mornings get in October when the fog hasn't fully lifted yet. I did not go inside. I drove back to the main road, parked behind an old equipment shed that blocked the view from the farmhouse windows, and I waited. 40 minutes later, 3 people came out of the farmhouse. My brother, a man in a sport coat, carrying a leather folder, and my wife. I watched them shake hands in the gravel drive. I watched my brother clap the man in the sport coat on the shoulder, the way he used to clap the shoulders of men he was about to do business with. I watched my wife say something that made both men laugh. Then I watched them get in their separate vehicles and drive away in separate directions, like 3 people who had never met. I drove back to the house we shared, my wife and I, in Nashville. I made a second pot of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about what I had just seen. And I turned it over in my mind the way you turn a piece of lumber, looking at it from every angle before you decide if it's straight or if it's warped. By the time she came home that afternoon, I had decided 2 things. First, that I was not going to say a word. Second, that I was going to understand exactly what I was dealing with before I made a single move. I called my son that evening. He is 34, works in commercial insurance, lives 40 minutes away. He has his grandfather's patience and his mother's intelligence, which I have always considered an unfair combination for anyone he might ever negotiate against. When I told him what I had seen, there was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." He had noticed things 6 months before I did. A conversation he had overheard at Thanksgiving fragments. Not enough to be certain, but enough to bother him. A comment my wife made about the property that seemed to assume more authority over it than was hers to have. A lunch meeting my brother had mentioned offhand that he later claimed had been about something else entirely. My son had been watching, quietly, the way I had taught him to watch a job site, looking for the stress fractures. He had not told me because he had no proof, and because he had not wanted to be wrong, and because he knew me well enough to know that if he told me before he was certain, I would go straight to my brother and confront him, and that would give them time to cover their tracks. He was right. That is exactly what I would have done. So we did not do that. Instead, we made a plan. Over the next 6 weeks, my son used his professional connections to request copies of every document that had been filed or was in progress regarding the property surveys, title searches, any applications or inquiries submitted to county planning. He found 3 things: an informal market appraisal that had been ordered in my brother's name alone, a draft agreement between my brother and a development company that proposed to sell 40 of the 47 acres at a per-acre price that was significantly below market, and a modification request filed with the county that attempted, using technical language my brother clearly hoped I would never read, to shift the majority ownership share into his name based on a claim that he had been the primary caretaker of the property since our father's illness. The claim was not completely false. He had visited more often than I had in the last 2 years of our father's life. But the reason I had visited less was that my father had asked me, privately, to stay in Nashville and look after our mother, who had been dealing with her own health problems at the time. I had letters. I had voicemails. I had my mother's own testimony, if it ever came to that. The piece that took longer to understand was my wife's role. She was not on any of the documents. She had been careful about that. But my son found the thread when he pulled on a small detail, the real estate brokerage on the sedan in the gravel drive. He looked them up. They specialized in rural land acquisition for residential developers. He called them professionally, asking general questions about their process, and confirmed that they had been in active consultation with a private party about a parcel in the county where our property sat. The agent he spoke with mentioned, without realizing what he was saying, that the contact for the seller's side had provided 2 names. One of them was my brother's. The other was my wife's married name. My name. She had given them my name as if it were hers to give. I have thought about that a great deal since then. The way a person can live beside you for 30 years and build, in the margins of that life, a version of themselves that you never saw. I don't know when she decided that what we had built together was something to be liquidated rather than kept. I don't know if there was a moment, a conversation, a season when everything changed. I only know that she had changed, and that by the time I understood it, she had already moved quite far in a direction I had not been invited to follow. I did not confront her. Not then. We continued living in the same house. I continued to be the man I had always been: coffee in the morning, back porch in the evening, quiet and steady, and apparently predictable enough that she had no reason to believe I knew anything at all. She would ask me occasionally, in the careful way of someone managing a situation, how I felt about eventually dealing with the property. I would say that I wasn't in a rush, that there was no reason to make decisions before we were ready. She would nod and change the subject. My brother called me twice in that period. Normal calls, or what had become normal for us, surface conversation, updates about his kids, a brief mention of the property that never went anywhere. I was pleasant. I was exactly the kind of older brother he had spent decades underestimating. It required very little effort. Do, The thing about spending your life building structures is that you understand something most people overlook. The strongest part of any structure is not the visible frame, it's the foundation. You can change everything above ground. You can tear out walls, move doors, remodel the entire face of a building. But if the foundation is solid, the building stands. And if the foundation is compromised, it doesn't matter how good the rest of it looks, it will eventually come down. My brother had spent a long time focused on the frame. He had not thought enough about the foundation. The family gathering happened in November. It was technically a belated celebration of what would have been my father's 82nd birthday. My mother's idea. Something she did every year. A Sunday afternoon at her house with his photograph on the mantel and his favorite food on the table. My brother and his wife came. My son came. My wife came. A few cousins. An aunt. My son and I had spent the previous 2 evenings organizing everything. Not into a dramatic presentation. Not into a confrontation. Into something cleaner than that. He had printed documents, the appraisal, the draft agreement, the county modification request, the correspondence from the brokerage. He had arranged them in a simple manila folder, and he had, through his insurance work, consulted with a real estate attorney about exactly what had been attempted and exactly what our options were. The attorney had been very clear. What had been filed with the county was, at minimum, a fraudulent misrepresentation of ownership share. What the brokerage had been engaged to facilitate, if it had proceeded, would have constituted a breach of fiduciary duty, and potentially worse. My wife's involvement, documented by her name appearing as a co-contact without my knowledge or consent, created its own significant legal exposure. None of it had been completed. The modification request had been flagged by the county clerk routine. Apparently, when a sole applicant claim involves jointly held inherited property and had stalled before any action was taken. The sale had not been finalized. No money had changed hands. They had come very close, but they had not crossed the final line. And I had found out before they did. I waited until my mother had gone to rest in her chair by the window, the way she does after she eats, the television low and her eyes half closed. Then I asked my brother if he could come into the kitchen for a moment. My wife was in the living room. My son was at the kitchen table. My brother walked in with the easy confidence of a man who believes he holds every card. He sat down across from my son, nodded at him, looked at me. I put the folder on the table, and I opened it. I did not raise my voice. I have never raised my voice at my brother. Not in 58 years. I was not about to start. I said, "I'd like you to walk me through what you and my wife have been working on with the property." He looked at the documents. I watched his face. He is not a man who panics quickly. My brother, I will give him that. He looked at the papers the way a man looks at a car accident from across the street, calculating whether he is close enough to be involved. Then he said, "George, I can explain." And my son said, quietly, not looking up from the folder, "The county modification request was filed 11 months ago. The brokerage consultation started 8 months before that. We have the dates. Loderin, Loderin, Loderin res." The silence in that kitchen was one of the longest I have experienced in 63 years of living. My brother's confidence left him the way air leaves a room when a window is opened in winter, not all at once, but steadily and completely. He said my wife's name, as if she were the one who was supposed to be there to manage this moment. I said, "She's in the other room. You can talk to her later. Right now you're talking to me." What followed was not a dramatic confession. There was no tearful explanation, no moment where he told me what had driven him to it. No speech about the shadow, or the years of feeling overlooked, or whatever story he had been telling himself to justify what he had done. He was quiet. He looked at the table. He said, twice, that it had not gone through, as if the incompletion of the betrayal was a kind of innocence. I told him what the attorney had told me. I told him what our options were. I told him that I had not yet decided which of those options I intended to pursue, and that my decision would depend entirely on what happened in the next several weeks. Then I told him one more thing. I told him that our father had trusted us equally because he believed we were equally worthy of that trust, and that whatever my brother had decided to feel about the distribution of that trust over the years, the fact remained that our father had not been wrong about me. I left him at the table with my son, and I walked into the living room. My wife was sitting near the window. She looked up when I came in, and she read my face the way people read a document they were hoping would say something different. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just looked at her. 30 years is a very long time. Long enough to build something that feels permanent. Long enough to forget that permanence is never guaranteed by time alone. I said, "We need to talk to a lawyer. Separately. I think." She started to say something. I said, "Not today. Not here. But soon." Then I went and sat beside my mother, who had opened her eyes at some point and was watching the room with the quiet attention of a woman who has lived long enough to understand that she does not always need to hear the words to know what they mean. She reached over and patted my hand without saying anything. That was 3 months ago. The county modification request has been formally withdrawn. The brokerage relationship has been terminated. My brother and I are no longer in regular contact, though our attorneys are. The property remains in both our names for now, which is where it was always supposed to be. My wife and I are separated. There is nothing dramatic to say about it. It is a grief like other griefs. Quiet and heavy, and something you carry rather than cure. I do not regret how I handled it. I regret that it happened. My son and I have dinner every Sunday. He sits across from me the way my father used to sit across from me, with that particular combination of patience and directness that skips a generation sometimes and lands exactly where it's needed. He told me recently that he had been afraid, when he first started noticing things, that I wouldn't believe him. That I would choose to believe what was easier to believe. I told him that his grandfather had raised me to look at a structure honestly, even when the honest answer was inconvenient. That I had tried to raise him the same way. He said he thought I had done all right. I am 63 years old. I am not the kind of man who needs to announce that he won something. I don't think about it in those terms. I think about it in terms of what held and what didn't. The foundation held. The frame came down. That's not a victory, it's just the nature of what gets built on what. My mother still keeps my father's photograph on the mantel. Last time I was there, I stood in front of it for a while. He was younger in the photograph than I am now, which is a strange thing to reckon with. Boarding day. And Pravat. Also man. He looked like a man who had worked hard and trusted carefully and slept without apology. I think I understand him better now than I did when he was alive. I think he would have understood the decisions I made. I think he would have been glad that I waited. I turned back to the front door and I left the photograph where it was, and I drove home to a house that is quieter than it used to be. And I made coffee. And I sat on the back porch with a book I had already read. And the evening was very still, and I was all right.